Good evening to all of you. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Radnor Memorial Library. My name is Pam Sador. I'm a reference librarian at Radnor Memorial Library, and I want to thank you all for joining us. This is wonderful. Just I was saying to Barksdale, this is how we build community. This is how we stay together when we have to be apart. And I really do appreciate your coming tonight. Our partners for this author event are Radnor Historical Society and Main Point Books, our independent bookstore here in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Jennifer Beacom, director at Radnor Historical Society, and Kathy Feeback at Main Point Books. You've been at my side for years in the Windsor Room and now virtually, and I appreciate all your help and helping us get our events here. And also I want to thank Temple University Press for this beautiful book. It was nice to connect with Temple University Press again, and they are the publisher of Barksdale's new book. This is gorgeous. This is the library's copy, and you can purchase the book at Main Point Books, our independent bookstore. But now let's get going, because I know you're all waiting to hear from Barksdale, and really welcome Barksdale to Radnor Memorial Library. Let me tell you a little bit about Barksdale. W. Barksdale Maynard is the author of 6 University Press books on history and art since 2002, several of them award-winning, as well as 2 co-authored business books. He was a lecturer in art history at Johns Hopkins and Princeton universities. As a journalist, his articles have appeared in more than 30 magazines and newspapers, including the Washington Post and New York Times. A native of Alabama, Barksdale lives in Wilmington, Delaware with his family. And Barksdale, I want to thank you for being our author this evening at your very own author event. And thank you for this beautiful book, Artists of Wyeth Country. And we are Wyeth Country. We are part of the Brandywine tradition here in Wayne, Pennsylvania. And I may as well give a shout out to Longwood Gardens, because Radnor Library, along with other libraries in Delaware County, participate in the Longwood Community Read. So I'm going to mute myself. I want to ask everyone here, please, to stay muted. And Barksdale is going to present for about the next 45 minutes. And then at the end of Barksdale's presentation, we've been invited to unmute ourselves and ask questions. If you feel better, more comfortable putting your question into the chat room, I will be monitoring the chat room. So thank you all for coming, and welcome, Barksdale.
Thank you so much, Pam. Can you all hear me? Is it good? It's really an honor to talk to you, and I'm grateful to Radnor Memorial Library and to Main Point Books for making this possible. Thank you. This book has been 3 years of my life, and so it's a terrific opportunity to be able to have it published and to be able to tell you about it and encourage you, I hope, to use it as a tool to explore Wyeth Country. Now let me try. I need to advance, but hold on a sec now. It's not advancing. Hang on. I don't know why it's not advancing. Well, there it went. Do I know how
That's
to do
great.
that?
That's perfect.
Now it's
Thank
working.
you.
Well, that's me as a kid, and it's by way of saying that I always loved nature, and that's the big theme of Artists of Wyeth Country. It's very much about nature, and I have to say, too, it will take you back to the 70s, which to me was the golden age, because that was the heyday of Andrew Wyeth, among other things. So it's an interesting exploration of our American culture, of art culture, and also of our love of nature. And again, that's the theme that runs throughout this book. How did these artists, Howard Pyle, his student, N.C. Wyeth, and then N.C.'s son, Andrew Wyeth, how do they respond to this beautiful nature we have here in the Brandywine Valley, west of Philadelphia? I had written a previous book about Walden Pond, and there are a lot of connections, really, between the world of the Wyeths and the world of Thoreau at Walden Pond. If you think about it, Walden Pond is a kind of getaway for the Bostonian about 20 miles west of Boston. It's a way to get out of the city and plunge yourself into nature. And the Brandywine Valley functions the same way. for Philadelphia. It's about 20 miles west, and it lets you escape the crowded city and rediscover our natural world. And that's Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond. And he's absorbing nature. He's swallowed up by nature. Do you remember from high school English that expression, the transparent eyeball, the idea of Thoreau and Emerson going out into nature, and they disappear, and nature pours into them as if they are simply a vehicle for the exploration of nature. Keep that in mind, the transparent eyeball, because I think that's how Andrew Wyeth functioned as an artist too. And again, there are extraordinary connections between Thoreau and Andrew Wyeth. That painting there you're looking at, that's painted by N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth had an almost obsessional devotion for the work of Henry David Thoreau. N.C. Wyeth was from Massachusetts, grew up not far from Walden Pond, and when N.C. Wyeth's youngest child was born, 100 years to the day after Henry David Thoreau, N.C. Wyeth took this as a kind of omen. And that little child there in the front was Andy Wyeth, born 100 years to the day after Henry David Thoreau. So what I argue in this book is if you're going to understand the paintings of N.C. Wyeth, and especially Andrew Wyeth, you need to understand these intellectual backgrounds in New England Transcendentalism and in Thoreau. Now I have to say right off the start, this is an unauthorized biography of Andrew Wyeth. And what does that mean for you as the reader? It means, I hope, that you're going to have some new interpretations, some new ideas may be explored here, some new questions might be asked that have not been asked in the previous authorized publications. What it means for the author is a lot of trouble. It is not easy to write an unauthorized biography. I often thought, well, the authorized biographer probably had the red carpet rolled out in front of him. Not the case with the unauthorized biographer. But again, I think it might be to the benefit of the reader. There's a lot of new information here. In part, this is a guidebook. The idea is you can take this book with you and go exploring. It's a little portable book. You can put it in the glove compartment of your car, come down here on the weekend to the Brandywine Valley and go exploring and stand where Andrew Wyeth stood and see what he saw. That's my goal with this book. You come here, you can literally walk in his footsteps and you can see exactly what he saw when he painted the landscapes of the Brandywine Valley. One thing I'm kind of proud of with this book are the aerial photographs. I dug these up. They've never been reproduced before. These are aerial pictures that show Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania in the 1920s and 1930s. And I've labeled on these aerial photographs all the places that Andrew Wyeth and N.C. Wyeth painted. This, for example, is Kerner Farm. That's really the heart of Andrew Wyeth Country, Kerner Farm. And if you've ever wondered what it looked like the day he started painting there in the 1930s, that aerial photograph shows you down to the smallest detail. That's Kerner Barn down there at the lower right, for example. So there are a lot of rich new sources in this book, from photographs, paintings, maps, aerial photographs to get you exploring. And just to remind you, Chadds Ford is that orange dot out to the west of Philadelphia, between Westchester and the Delaware circular border. And Chadds Ford is a strange place, I have to say, having explored it for 3 years for this book. You know, it's not quite country, but it's not quite city. It's right at that interchange, that intersection between the far outer suburbs of Philadelphia and then where you start to see some farms and some cows. And so it occupies this strange intermediate zone. And I think you've got to understand Chadds Ford to understand Andrew Wyeth, who was born there, who lived all his life there, who died there. You know, Andrew Wyeth was sometimes kind of rustic and kind of like a bumpkin. And other times he seems very sophisticated and very, savvy and urban. So he too, I think, features in this story of Chadds Ford as an in-between and kind of peculiar environment. Now, what do you know about Andrew Wyeth? I have people, more than once, I've had someone come up to me and say, I know Chadsford really well, and I'm going to show you the hillside where he painted that girl crawling up the hill. Well, the girl crawling up the hill was not Chadsford. Christina is in Maine, and Andrew Wyeth had this bifurcated life, winters in Chadsford, summers in Maine. My book is not about Maine. In fact, this is one of the first Wyeth books not to be about Maine at all, because I wanted to keep it focused. I think it's important to tell the Pennsylvania story, which is very rich and very coherent and very complex. If you miss Christina, though, there is a Chadsford connection. Andrew Wyeth said, if I hadn't seen that dead crow in the field, I never would have painted Christina's world. That dead crow in the field precedes Christina's world. And if you look closely, there are a lot of strange parallels, aren't there, between the crow and the distant hillside and the farmhouse, and then the much more famous painting, Christina's World. You know, if you've been to the Philadelphia Museum, the magnificent painting called Groundhog Day. It's one of the great glories of the Philadelphia Museum. And I think, to me, this might be the greatest painting by Andrew Wyeth of Chadsford, of the Chadsford years. It is magnificently composed. It's painted in the farmhouse of Carl Kerner, where Wyeth went practically daily. But Kerner's not there. It's where Kerner would have sat at the table. So it's a kind of portrait of Kerner without Kerner actually appearing. And this was something of great interest to Andrew Wyeth. You can still visit Kerner Farm. Come down with the book, bring the book, come on down, go exploring, take the Kerner Farm tour, and you can go in the kitchen of the Kerner farmhouse and you can stand exactly where Andrew Wyeth stood 60 years ago when he painted Groundhog Day. You can look out the window and you can judge for yourself. Did he paint what he saw, or did he make things up? And that's one of the big themes of this book, is trying to answer that question. Did he paint what he saw, or did he make things up? Now, I have to tell every audience that Andrew Wyeth was once very, very famous. And this is a fact people tend to forget. In fact, it's a little heartbreaking, but I've never met anybody under the age of 40 who's ever heard of Andrew Wyeth. I mean, it's an extraordinary generation gap there. But those of us over the age of 40 remember that he was inescapable in the 1960s and 1970s. He was everywhere. He's on the cover of Time magazine. And this interests me a lot because, look, how many artists in the future are ever going to be on the cover of Time magazine? I have to say, painters don't matter the way they used to matter in the 60s and in the 70s, when they were really major cultural figures and people knew their names. Andrew Wyeth became so famous, he's repeatedly invited to the White House. There he is with Pat Nixon in 1970 in the East Room of the White House. Now, he looks happy, doesn't he? He was a complicated man. He often was mischievous and cheery on the outside, but on the inside, there was a lot going on. And he did not like being out of Chadsford and in the public spotlight. And in fact, I believe he was deeply uncomfortable at the moment this photograph was taken. And in fact, the same year, 1970, is when he strikes up a new relationship in his life with a Chadsford married housewife named Helga Tesdorf. And I think this relationship with Helga, which lasted for decades, was his way of retreating from the public eye, retreating from expectations, retreating from his wife, who was his business manager of an exceedingly effective business manager. Andrew Wyeth retreats into the fields and into the woods of Chadsford with Helga, and he forms this extremely private relationship out of the glare of the public spotlight. He's invited back to the White House by President George W. Bush. He receives a big medal. This is a big deal late in life. Andrew Wyeth turns to President Bush and he says, Mr. President, you and I have a lot in common. President Bush said, what on earth do you mean? I'm the leader of the free world. And Andrew Wyeth said, everybody hates us. Now, what Andrew Wyeth meant was the critics did not like Andrew Wyeth. And all Andrew Wyeth's life, he was pestered and vilified by the art critics in New York, who never could see the point of his artwork. But the public loved him. For every critic who hated him, there were 10,000 people among the general public who thought he was the greatest living artist. And if you remember the 70s, you couldn't go to anybody's house, it seemed to me, who had a coffee table that Wyeth at Kerner's wasn't sitting on the coffee table. This book was everywhere. This book is a major cultural phenomenon in American life. I interviewed a lot of people for this book. I interviewed a lot of artists, and I interviewed several artists in the South, and they said, I had no access to a museum. I'd never seen a painting hanging on a wall, but the public library had Wyeth at Kerner's, and it changed my life. This book had an extraordinary potency in introducing people across the United States to art as a career, to art as a passion. And I think the legions of plein air artists we have today, a lot of them were deeply inspired by Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth's career seemed to be waning after the 1970s. Nobody seemed to think about him much, but then suddenly in the 80s, this big explosion when the Helga pictures were revealed to the world. You might remember this in the summer of 1986. Andrew Wyeth's stunning secret, said Time magazine. And suddenly he's famous all over again for quite a bizarre reason, actually, this series of paintings of Helga that he hadn't told his wife he was doing. When he died, about a dozen years ago, the critics pounced one last time. And one of the obituary writers, I think it might have been the New York Times, said, a strangely circumscribed life has produced a sadly circumscribed art. And I really have pondered that statement because there is some truth to that. He never went anywhere. He only went to Chad's Fort. But you know, that's like Henry David Thoreau, who said, I traveled widely and conquered. Well, Andy Wyeth traveled widely in Chad's Fort in about a 2-mile radius, which is about between Walden Pond and Concord. But if you choose to lead a circumscribed life, does it necessarily mean that your art is going to be bad, as the reviewer implies? That's a deep question. What I argue in the book is that you cannot understand Andrew Wyeth's circumscribed life unless you understand the importance of walking to his painting method. It's absolutely key. Like Henry David Thoreau, Andrew Wyeth went out in the morning all alone. He had to be alone for this to work. And he walked through the hills and he walked through the fields of Chad's Fort. And he's seeking artistic inspiration, just as Thoreau, all alone, was seeking some sort of literary inspiration. And so when Andrew Wyeth paints this famous picture of himself striding through a Chad's Fort field, and he's wearing Howard Pyle's old boots, I think this is a real metaphor for his artistic process. He walks, he's seeking artistic inspiration. It may not come that day, it may not come that week, but eventually through walking, the inspiration will come. And I have in the book quite a few photographs never reproduced before that show Andrew Wyeth out walking in Chad's Fort. Here he is, he's just gotten out of his old 50s station wagon, and he's got his sketchbook under his arm, and he's got his boots on, and he's ready to go marching off through the fields and through the hills of Chad's Fort. There he goes up Kerner Hill, alone. He's got to be alone, just as Thoreau insisted on being alone. He's got to be alone for this process to work. And he's watching nature, looking all the time. He always had his dog, though. The dogs were allowed to come. Andrew Wyeth would sit on the ground and he would sketch, and he would throw the sketches around and he'd throw the watercolors around, and the dog would just walk right over the watercolors. And actually curators are glad, because curators can date Andrew Wyeth watercolors by the size of the dog's paw prints on the picture, because he had different sized dogs in different years. Now, look closely at this photograph, which is Kerner Hill looking down to Kerner Farm. And I'm going to show you the same view today. And this is one of the big themes of the book, is boy, the landscape has changed in 60 years in the Brandywine Valley. Look what happens when I show you the modern view. Look how much more vegetated the landscape is today. Look how the forests have reclaimed what was an agricultural landscape. Everything has grown up. These are the two great themes ecologically in Chad's Ford: suburban sprawl and the forest reclaiming the landscape. What does this mean? It means that Wyeth Country does not resemble Wyeth Country as the Wyeths knew it. It's really changed. So here's one of the maps in the book. And the idea is you can follow the trails, you can follow the route. That's all shown in red there on the map. The forests on the map are the forests of 1940, not today, but the forests of 1940, because I want you to get a sense when you're holding the map that, oh my gosh, there weren't so many woods then, really quite few forests in 1940. But look at the little gray houses at the bottom. All the gray things have been built since 1940. So you can see the suburbanization. So the maps, I hope, are a kind of time travel taking you back into the world of the Wyeths. Now, Andrew Wyeth had a bad hip, and so it became painful to walk in middle life. And so he started driving everywhere. And you see him here, he's got his dog under his arm, and he's about to go driving off through the countryside of Chad's Ford. He had a series of tank-like trucks that he would use to go roaring over the hilltops and racing through the woods. And literally, he acted like he owned the place. He went anywhere, he went everywhere in his truck. One homeowner told me, and let me say that in the age of suburbanization, this became a bit of a problem that he just drove everywhere. One suburban homeowner said, I didn't mind so much when he drove through my front yard, but when he drove under the laundry line in the back, that was a problem. But he didn't care. He went everywhere. That quite extraordinary painting he did of Carl Kerner, as Carl Kerner was dying, and the allegorical picture called Spring, that shows Kerner seeming to melt away with the snowbank underneath a Howard Pyle moon on Kerner's Hill. Have you ever noticed with this painting the ruts of the tires in the hillside? Those tire tracks are, of course, Andrew Wyeth's truck tracks. And Andrew Wyeth appears in the painting, doesn't he, invisibly through his truck. Carl Kerner would say to Andy, why can't you stay where it's not muddy? but Andrew Wyeth didn't care. He rode that truck everywhere. When Andrew Wyeth, as a very young man, was admitted to the National Academy of Design, he had to submit a self-portrait. And I think this is a very revealing self-portrait. What's he doing in the self-portrait? He's out walking. He's walking down Kerner's Hill, and he's got a sketch pad under his arm. So I've got a whole chapter in the book. I call it The Walking Painter. And I guess if I had a discovery, this would be one of the discoveries, is that I think walking is the critical explanation for how he approached the process of painting the landscape. Here in a letter he wrote to a friend, he includes a sketch of a stump, a chestnut stump. He said, it impressed me as I passed by how I wish I had the hands to put all of this down. And this is a constant theme with Andrew Wyeth. He thinks he's never a good enough artist to do justice to nature. In fact, I argue he puts nature first. I think, I mean, it's kind of a iconoclastic statement, but I think he's actually more interested in nature than he is in painting. I think that might explain why some people don't like his art. They might sense that he's not fully committed to the painting aspect of art, but he's really committed to the nature that underlies his art. That's a very Victorian idea, really, to put nature first. It hasn't interested New York art critics in the last 80 years or so. But Andrew Wyeth, if he's nothing else, he's extremely old-fashioned in his outlook. What he's seeking as he walks through nature is what he calls the flash impression. Suddenly something hits him like a thunderbolt and he's just got to paint it. And I think in this case, the flash impression was the shadow as it crosses that huge sycamore tree. And you can just imagine him seeing that and then racing back home, and that's my painting. I've got to work on that painting. That's going to be it. These flash impressions. Nature speaking to him. He is the transparent eyeball. Nature tells him what approach to take and what to paint. You see that in Young Bull, for example, the shadows raking across the bull's body. That no doubt was the impression. That's the thing that struck him so powerfully. It's a beautiful portrait of Kerner Farm. You see Kerner Hill in the background. But you notice you don't see the telephone poles that used to line, still do, line Ring Road, or you might have noticed them in the old photograph I showed you, but the power lines, the telephone poles, he leaves those out. He does not like modernity. I call Andrew Wyeth anti-modern, and he really is. It's a powerful strain in his thought, and he doesn't like the 20th century. The only exception, and there are quirky exceptions, he seems to like the TV antenna on Carl Kerner's roof. He does show that quite often, but you know, Carl Kerner had fancy tractors and harvesters and balers and combines. Carl Kerner had a fancy farm. You never see any of that stuff. It never appears. You might as well be in the Middle Ages in an Andrew Wyeth painting. There's Kerner Farm today. I've got a whole chapter on Kerner Farm. It's very important and it's very mysterious to me. I love the Brandywine Valley. We have some of the most beautiful farms in the United States in the Brandywine Valley. And this is not one of them. It's just not one of the prime examples of the great beauty of our region. How did he find artistic inspiration in this perfectly ordinary place, not for days or weeks, but for decades? That's extraordinary, very mysterious. He got one of his famous flash impressions. It was late in the afternoon. He was coming over the top of Kerner's Hill. He sees the Kerner farmhouse reflected in the cattle pond where the brown Swiss cattle would come to drink. And he got a huge flash impression, the reflection of that house. I've got to paint that. He runs back to the studio and starts this famous picture called Brown Swiss. Brown Swiss. Brown Swiss was very famous. Did you ever watch The Partridge Family on TV? Did you ever look closely as Danny was coming out of the kitchen, the redheaded Danny, and what's right behind him on the wall? Brown Swiss. Wyeth, the potency of Andrew Wyeth in the 60s and 70s, you just cannot overestimate it. He was everywhere. And yet, Andrew Wyeth was totally disinterested in the 1960s. If you look at his painting there at the lower left, called Tenant Farmer, 1961, of a famous old colonial house in Chadds Ford. It's a painting of 1961, but it does not belong in 1961. I mean, it really belongs in the late Middle Ages. As far as the way it's painted, as far as the subject matter, you see none of the technology of the 1960s. You see none of the bright colors of advertisements in the 1960s. You certainly wouldn't know there was a space race. I mean, this is an extraordinary artist. He's taking you back into another world, some bygone world that frankly had long since ceased to exist. And he's completely out of step with contemporary modern artists. I mean, we've known that forever. Everyone says this about Andrew Wyeth. These are all paintings of 1961. They're all paintings of 1961. Clifford Still, Tom Wesselman, Andy Warhol, and Andrew Wyeth simply bears no relationship. So what's going on here? Why does he persist in painting in this retrograde, deliberately retrograde way? But you know, of course, modernists don't get him at all. But what I talk about in the book is the fact that a lot of representational painters didn't understand him either. And I think we've completely missed this point. Oh, excuse me, I skipped one. Oh, I might have dropped one out. Well, my point is that even a representational artist like Fairfield Porter would not really have understood the paintings of Andrew Wyeth because they're not so literal as he is. His approach is highly literal. What he sees is what he paints. There's very little distortion. There's very little metamorphosis of nature into art. Instead, it's nature transcribed into art. I call him the artist of the absolutely accurate, because he once wrote a letter saying, that's my goal, absolute accuracy. And you see this from the beginning of his career. Here's a drawing, I think, back in the 1930s. And he's trying to portray the flowers coming up in the spring around the base of the beech tree. And he's just struggling to get it absolutely exactly accurate. Carl Kerner killed him, a turkey buzzard, when Andrew Wyeth was a young painter. And Wyeth took the thing back to his studio and he drew it and he painted it. And when he paints a turkey buzzard, every feather is shown. I mean, it could be a diagram in an ornithology textbook. Extremely accurate, extremely detailed. It's a famous turkey buzzard, though. You might have had it on a postage stamp when you mailed a letter in 2017. His famous picture called Soaring. The absolute accuracy is extremely perplexing to me. It's, of course, a lot of why the public loves his work. I mean, it is dazzling. Has there ever been a greater technician in the field of watercolor that he could paint those flowers and they look absolutely the way flowers look when the sunlight is striking them in just a certain way? I mean, it is dazzling. It is dazzling. But what about the accuracy with which he portrays the corn cobs there at the lower right? I mean, is it really necessary to paint an old dried up corn cob with that level of almost excruciating detail? Like, you know, I understand that it is an incredible tour de force to paint like that. But why paint like that? If you're the greatest artist of your generation, in the public estimation, you are the greatest, you are pointing the way. A withered corn cob. Why? I think we have to ask this. There may be no answer, but I think we should ask. He does some magazine illustrations early on. Nobody much mentions it, but he did actually start out in illustration like his father. And he's going to do the cover of Saturday Evening Post. And he says, well, okay, I'm going to do an autumnal scene. I'm going to do one of these great sycamore trees in Chadds Ford. But he's not going to make the tree up. He gets a ladder and he climbs up in the tree. I know this because I interviewed a man who was a little boy who helped him prop up the ladder against the tree and remembers it very vividly. So you're not going to, if you're Andrew Wyeth, you're not going to imagine nature. You have to see nature and then you interpret it. That was the tree, the great sycamore tree in front of Lafayette's headquarters on the battlefield of the Brandywine. And his famous picture, Pennsylvania Landscape, painted during the Second World War. It's his love letter to Chadds Ford and to the great sycamore trees and to the colonial heritage of our region. Incredibly accurate. How do we know incredibly accurate? I'll make the claim this is incredibly accurate. How can I prove it to you? Well, if you look at the preliminary sketch, that looks like almost a photographic level of accuracy. By the way, he never used the camera. He couldn't stand cameras. He thought cameras sucked the life out of art. And I have to say, there are a lot of realist painters today that I wish they would learn that same lesson, that if you use a camera, it tends to suck the life out of what you're doing. He did this by hand. It's hand drawn, meticulous, very patient hand drawing. What if you take the preliminary drawing and compare it to the painting? It's never been done. But the preliminary drawing and the painting are identical. There is no modification. The only modification is that by the time he finished the painting, the leaves had fallen off the tree. So the leaves are gone. in the painting. Now, this is a deep mystery. Who was going to find out that Andrew Wyeth had done this accurately? I mean, maybe he cheated. Maybe all the branches were rearranged. Who would know the difference? Who was going to go to Chad's Ford in the middle of World War II and climb some lonely hillside and look at that tree and say, look, Andrew Wyeth moved the branches around? No one would have known. He could have gotten away with it. But there's just no artistic license with Andrew Wyeth. He has this compulsion to paint what he sees. And it's got to be the real thing. In fact, I've compared the tree then and the tree now. The tree is still there. The tree's bigger, but look, the branch pattern is just exactly identical. When he paints the Barnes Brenton house, one thing that strikes me in this extraordinary painting is the willow tree on the left. You can see the buds at the tips of every branch. It is just an extraordinary, I call him our greatest portrait painter of trees in all of America. I did some searching though, and I found a photograph of this house taken just a couple of years after the painting. And the photograph is quite fascinating because it shows what Andrew Wyeth left out. He's not interested in the modern world. He doesn't show the downspouts. He doesn't show the electrical wires. He certainly doesn't show the electrical meters. I mean, the house looks like it's from the Middle Ages. You wouldn't think that actually in real life it had a washer and a dryer and a television set. He doesn't show you the Champion spark plug sign. He doesn't show you the concrete US 1 highway that runs literally 2 feet from the front of the house. Modern life vanishes, and he takes you back into this imagined world of the past. And looking at the photograph, I thought, well, he probably leaned against that telephone pole when he did the drawing. I mean, that would have been a convenient place, wouldn't it, to lean up against the telephone pole? And then it made me think, well, what if I took that photograph and I flipped it? Because if I flipped it, you could almost get the view that Andrew Wyeth had as he looked back towards that tree. And so I flipped it. And look how the tree lines up with the photograph. I mean, again, it's simply unbelievable. Every branch is shown exactly as it appeared the day he stood there. It's extraordinary. This is not usual in the history of art since 1850. And I'm not just talking about Jackson Pollock. I'm talking about representational artists. They generally do not approach art from this stance of the need for almost a compulsive accuracy. It's very different. If you look at the painting Adam, which is, I think, a masterpiece painting, and if you look closely at Adam, the next time you're at the Brandywine River Museum, go over to the far left of the painting and look at those old broomsticks leaning up against the wall. If you lean in close, you'll see that Andrew Wyeth paints the wood grain in each of those broomsticks. And I just can't get that out of my head, that he would paint the wood grain in a broomstick. I mean, I know you could paint the wood grain in a broomstick, but why would you? It's not the usual approach, unless you're Albrecht Dürer in 1500 maybe, and Dürer was his idol. I think part of it is Howard Pyle. Howard Pyle, the great illustrator. Howard Pyle had a weakness for wood and splintered wood. He loved painting splintered wood. A lot of his battle scenes, the attack on the Chew House in Germantown, there on the left, and look how the wood is splintered by a cannonball. And I'm sure Andrew Wyeth, when he was 12 years old, he looked at that painting and he said, someday I'm going to be able to do that. And so splintered wood is a definite theme in Andrew Wyeth. But the art critics don't like this. They don't like the broomstick with the wood grain. One critic wrote in 1967 that in the end, his art seems the product not so much of inner vision as of an empty, if superficially brilliant observation, typified by exhibitionist virtuosity. So that's really what I've been talking about tonight, that he's clearly virtuoso in his ability to paint. He is a virtuoso. He's one of the great masters of all time in handling paint. He knows how to handle paint. But does he have anything to say? According to the critic, he lacks inner vision. All he has is superficially brilliant observation. You will have to decide that for yourself. That's one of the mysteries of Andrew Wyeth. You have to decide for yourself if you think he's one of the true greats, or if you think that maybe he's not in the rank of the greats because he lacks a certain vision. Again, certainly the modernists couldn't understand him. That's what I was trying to say before, but I don't think Thoreau or Fairfield Porter would understand him either. I think they would be just as perplexed as the modernists. If you look at Graham Sutherland in England, who's Andrew Wyeth's contemporary, and you'd think they'd have everything in common. They both worshiped nature. They both walked and walked for hours. They sketched like crazy. But when Graham Sutherland did those sketches, he took them back to the studio and the sketches changed and changed. He did more sketches, and the final painting doesn't look like nature hardly at all. It looks like art. Not the way Andrew Wyeth worked. The sketch is the painting. That's what you get. The orchard really was the center, I think, of his love of nature. He returns to the orchard again and again. It's right above his childhood home. It's in the orchard that N.C. Wyeth said to Andrew Wyeth as a teenager, "It's time for you to become an artist. You will never go to school again. I'm pulling you out of school because school is terrible. School just ruins artists. And you're going to go into the orchard and you're going to draw that apple tree." And that was the beginning of Andrew Wyeth's art education with his father, drawing the apple tree. And so this orchard is just sacred ground for him. And again, he paints it for decades. Always, the emphasis is on the accuracy, portraits of these individual trees, and I dare say he must have loved each of these trees. He portrays them so carefully. His father loved the trees for the fruit harvest. Remember, N.C. Wyeth was from Massachusetts, and he took his pear and apple harvest very, very seriously. But it's into the orchard that Andrew Wyeth brings Helga. And I think this is almost the symbolic heart of their relationship, is this orchard. He paints her there again and again and again. And as he paints her, she blends with nature. She merges with those old orchard trees. The same light that falls on those old tree trunks falls across her young, beautiful face. And she's merged, she's blended. I think she is, for him, the Thoreauvian ideal, the person who goes into nature. He sees her as innocent, young, entirely open to the magic of nature. And nature just flows into her. I think this is a big component of their relationship together. And he even shows her as Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers, with that beautiful garland of spring flowers and the light pouring across. Again, it's very Victorian, this idea of losing yourself in nature, that the human's true spiritual home is in the forest, is in the fields. It's part of the mystery of Andrew Wyeth that he would persist in this approach. Centuries old, into the 20th century, with all of our modern problems and complications and difficulties, and yet he retreats and he insists that this really is the way for the artist, this deep, loving exploration of nature. You have to decide for yourself. Come down to Chad's Ford, stand where he stood, see what he saw, and ask yourself, is he among the greats? Is his approach an extraordinarily fruitful and exciting one? Or is it to some extent a kind of escape and an abnegation of modern life and modern problems? In the end, I have to say, Andrew Wyeth remains a profound mystery. Thank you all very much. Thanks.
mute myself, and I'm now unmuted. Barksdale, that was wonderful. And thank you for your perception and your comparisons and contrasts. And this is a wonderful book. I know I want it living in my glove compartment. When you're
Good.
on the way to Longwood or when you're on your way to Brandywine Battlefield, you'll have it at the ready. It's heavy, the images, they're beautiful. And that's why I really commend Temple University Press for doing such a fine job with this beautiful book. And again, I remind you, it's available through our independent bookstore here in downtown Wayne, Main Point Books. Let's open it up to questions. If anyone, feel free, if you'd like to unmute yourself at this point. Barksdale said that he'd love to hear from anyone here tonight. Anyone? You can unmute
Hi.
yourself.
Hi, my name is Babette Besk, and I wanted to know if you had discussed your book with Victoria Wyeth, if you'd been in touch with her.
Great question.
I wrote a previous book called The Brandywine, An Intimate Portrait, and Victoria was extremely helpful, as was Jamie Wyatt. But something changed between then and this book. And with this book, it was made quite clear that there would be no cooperation.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I mean, I can see that. You didn't share Andy's his life in Maine or his mystery, that a lot of his paintings aren't accurate, that they're actually symbolic and allegorical. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Babette. Should we take a look at the chat room? I don't know. Oh, William Lawler. Oh, he's our board president. Hello, Bill.
This was a great presentation, and thank you so much. It was
Thanks,
very
Bill.
captivating. So a quick question on an unauthorized biography. What was your most challenging limitation in doing your presentation as an author here?
You mean as far as being unauthorized, the challenges of that?
Yes.
I'm a fan of Nabokov, the Russian writer, and his biographer seemed to undergo a similar series of trials. The Nabokov family would not allow him any access to any archives of any kind. Everything was off limits. And at the same time, Nabokov had built up a huge sort of mythical apparatus around himself. Nabokov wanted to shape the story. And that's very much true with Andrew Wyeth, who told so many stories to the authorized biographer that they've built up into a mountain of legend, myth and legend. So, to try to peek around that great mountain was part of the challenge. I interviewed everyone I could who was willing to talk, and I was grateful for everyone who did talk to me, people who knew Andrew Wyeth. It seemed to me important to write this book now because, look, Andrew Wyeth would be over 100 years old now. People who knew him are getting fewer and fewer and fewer every year. So, I figure a future biographer will be given access to all the archives. That's great. Good for that person. But what I could do is to talk to some of these people who, while they are still living. And I have to say, they have very interesting, different perspectives. And I asked every one of them, have you been interviewed before? And every one of them said, no, no one has ever asked me anything. No one's ever interviewed me. So I do feel in that sense, whether the book is good or bad, it does at least record the living memories of people who knew him.
Right. One just follow-up question, sir, is what was your relationship with the museum? Were they helpful at all as collaborators, or were they really just on their own?
It became clear very early, as I said, that there would be would not be cooperation. The end result of all of this, I think, paradoxically, if you go to the Brandywine River Museum of Art and you go in the museum store and you ask for this book, which you think would be a pretty good guidebook for the tourist from Indiana, they will not sell this book in the store.
That's
at the Brandywine River
surprising.
Museum.
Oh,
Yeah, because whether you're Longwood or Brandywine, you want to be self-supporting, and something like this, I just, I
I'll
think it
say
would be a
it
good
gives
thing.
it gives me no joy whatsoever to say that.
Right.
But it is true. I mean, I simply state it because it's true.
Mhm.
And thank goodness for Main Point Books. You know,
Can I make a comment?
that sells the book.
May I make a comment?
Yes. Mhm.
I knew him.
Oh, you
And
did?
when I knew him, the very first thing that impressed me, besides his dog, all of his family and his wife, was his business manager. And his business manager hovered around him very intently. My father was great in his field. My father was his fencing coach
Oh my gosh, yeah.
from the University of Pennsylvania. And my dad was great in his field. He revolutionized fencing and built champions. And Wyeth had lessons with my dad in his studio from 72 to 73.
That's great.
And I was a college student at that point, and I would be there helping with the fencing lessons in his studio. But that did impress me, is that it almost seemed like a constraint. Now, I was novice to the world, and my dad was a humble person, made his own weapons even.
Wow.
And people collect them. But his business manager probably influenced how things are run today, is my guess.
What's your dad's name?
Maestro Chisar, University of Pennsylvania, Olympic
That's great.
coach.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I meet so many people who met Andrew Wyeth, and it's always such a pleasure to hear their reminiscences. I will say that.
And they liked my mom a lot. My parents were European. My mother was really shocked when they would have them over to dinner at their home, which apparently my mother would describe it as a mill over water, and she would be so worried about the art. My mother was a war survivor, and I can understand why she was concerned about the art.
Everyone I met in Chadsford remembers Andrew Wyeth so fondly, and I think it's a tremendous testament to his personality that he was just charming and made people feel they were special. He was famous, but he took the time with people. He was friendly, funny, sort of ribald, a remarkable man.
Well, he had big feet. I remember that distinctly because I would stand right next to him when we were warming up for fencing lessons. You would have people lined up kind of in a row. And I also remember when I asked him where the bathroom was, I walked past all these props.
Yeah.
You know, like things that I think must have been in his dad's paintings now that I've seen his dad's paintings. And
Yeah, that's
that
right.
was quite an adventure just to go find the bathroom and come back. And there were soldiers, lead soldiers lining the walls.
Yeah.
And we fenced over a grate. I remember that too. That was a little creepy for me to be fencing over a big metal grate. I'd love to see it.
You're so lucky.
Remembering it accurately.
Really?
That's
Most
what I
people
remember.
never got to see the studio, so you were so lucky to have that opportunity.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks.
Actually, the studio is open to the public, just so you know that.
It is, because I'm picturing, how do you pronounce your name? Augie?
Yes, my name's Hungarian, and actually that would be
Okay.
how you should pronounce it.
Augie. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking, because that house, Barksdale, the White House that you can walk in and see the props, because I took a tour a few years ago, and you're right, things are still there. We're running out of time, and I know people have raised their hands, but thank you, Augie. That was a wonderful story, and thank you for sharing it with us. And who has raised their hands? I knew him. Thank you. Great program. Andrew was a fun character. Thank you for keeping him in discussion. And I totally agree, Marilyn. Anyone else would like to? I have Jim Garrison, an architect of renown, in the room right now. Just had to open the door and let him in. And who else? Raised hands.
Hi, Pam.
Hi, Chris.
How are you?
Okay, who's this?
This is Chris Mills.
Oh, hi, Chris. I saw you in earlier. Would you
There we
like
go.
to You can have the floor. Barksdale's still with us here.
Oh, thank you. This is a terrific presentation and fascinating work. I appreciate your pulling it together, and Barksdale for taking the
Oh,
time.
I got lucky with the bookstore in Temple, but go ahead.
Yeah, you're thinking about this idea of the artistic license. I wonder whether, given his reverence for nature and the reporting, whether the artistic license might have emerged from the paint itself, that as an organic substance with the pigment in the vehicle, the infinite variation that would come when he invited it to take shape on the canvas, that may have been the license, that he is enabling that to happen.
I think he constantly uses the word emotional to describe his art. And he would say, well, I could capture nature more realistically and more accurately if I could really express the emotions I feel towards it. So there's a mystery there, no question about it. You know, what happens to the paint as he's working in the studio, that infinite patience, the pouring of himself into it. There's an artistic mystery. There's something that happens there in the studio that we cannot probably fully understand. But he clearly thought his art was full of emotion. Babette mentioned his imagination, and yes, he did feel very strongly that his imagination played the key role in his art. But you know, to reach a final conclusion about him is just impossible. Everyone sees him differently. It's so paradoxical in that the things that one person loves about him, like the fact that his style of art never changed, really never changed, that's a plus to some. You know, he stuck by his guns. He didn't listen to the critics. He kept doing what he was best at. But then to the other person, they'll say, gosh, how could he have been so unimaginative as to never try anything else in 70 years? So, you know, in a way, reputationally, he cannot win, because his strength to one person is the shortcoming to another.
And yet every brushstroke would have been different.
Yeah, I can say in terms of painting, he was incredibly patient. I mean, he really, like a 19th century master or a Renaissance master, he took the time in almost clearly a painstaking way. I think that the heyday of that was the 50s and 60s. I mean, his skills were at their height in the 50s and 60s. Some of those paintings are simply breathtaking, what he was able to achieve.
Here's a question from Jean. Is this for sale at Hopkins bookstore?
Yes.
Good.
I'm told that it is. Yeah. And thanks for being interested in it. Thanks.
Yeah. And you're an artist yourself.
Well,
right?
Having just talked about Andrew Wyeth, I'm not going to make that claim.
I know,
No,
but
I'm not.
obviously you're a Wyeth lover, as we are Wyeth lovers. And did you find yourself there living in Delaware, and you felt like you were creating what you wanted to be a part of, maybe?
Well, I think I do feel,
because that benefits us all.
I think many artists feel a sense that I wish I could have been Andrew Wyeth, in the sense that all he had to do was paint. I mean, that's all he ever had to do. No one ever said to him, you know, Andy, run down to the bank and cash this check. They just said, go paint. And he painted. I mean, anyone who's an artist will feel the sense of how blessed he was to be able to do that. What a terrific life. Does that produce great art? Or does like the terrible struggle of a Rothko produce better art than the art produced by someone who is frankly somewhat indulged by those around him and allowed to do nothing with paint? These are deep questions.
Yes.
Hard to answer.
Okay. And we are out of time, but Barksdale, thank you so much. This is a beautiful book, and I'd like to thank everyone here this evening for joining us. For Artists of Wyeth Country, Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, and Andrew Wyeth. And I know it's available at our library, Radnor Memorial Library, and also at our indie bookstore in downtown Wayne, Main Point Books. And thank you to my partners, Main Point Books and Radnor Historical Society. Thank you all for coming. Barksdale, I hope with your next book, you'll pay a visit to our library in Wayne. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you so much, Pam.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
everything.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks to all of you. Good
And
night.
thank you all
Thank
very
you.
much for coming. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.